There's a growing movement among those who are supposed to be of the faith of falling away from the faith in who the Bible calls the Messiah or Christ, which obviously necessitates a rejection of the so-called New Testament. If you're wondering why I say so-called New Testament, check out my video called What is the New Testament for the biblical definition of the term. But for the sake of this video, I will sometimes refer to the epistles and gospels as the New Testament. This video is not for those who are adversaries to the Messiah, but rather this video is for those who believe but may not know how to effectively defend their faith from these onslaughts. This is to help you remain confident in your faith. This video will expound on the secular information and reasons you can confidently believe in the New Testament text. First, we're going to address whether or not Yahshua HaMashiach, called Jesus Christ, actually existed, according to history. What you're going to realize is that there is more attestation to the existence of Christ than most figures in history. Let's get some background on a term that's going to be used in this video. Acts chapter 11 verse 26. It says, "And when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. And the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch." The disciples of Christ were the first to be called Christians, which is something that other people called them. You understand that? Christ's ministry was only in Israel. That's the only place he taught. Therefore, these were the first people to be called Christians for following Christ. Acts chapter 21 verse 20 says, "And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law." These are the elders in Judea speaking to Paul. And they said, "Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe." They're talking about believe on Christ. That's the context when you read this chapter. So there were thousands of Judeans, thousands of Israelites who believed on Yahshua. And yes, people of other nations as well started to believe after them. Nero was an emperor in Rome who famously burned Rome and blamed it on the Messianics, who were called Christians. We're going to read what a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus wrote, who was alive during that time. And he wrote about what happened. He is not a believer on Christ. He was not a quote-unquote Christian. Let's see what he wrote. And this is about 67 AD that this happened. It says, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration," meaning the fire, "was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace." So as you can see, Nero blamed the Christians, which is, again, an epithet for the Messianics. And it says Christus, from whom the name had its origin. So he's referencing Christ here. Why would he do that if the man never existed? Remember, this man is not a believer on Christ. It says he's just writing about historical events that took place during his life. It says, "Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So it said Christ is suffered the extreme penalty. And what is that? That's death. It says during the reign of Tiberius. Tiberius was the emperor during the time that Christ was put to death. If you read Luke chapter 3, verse 1, it'll tell you that Tiberius was the emperor. And then it says at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. The Gospels let you know that Pontius Pilate was the procurator that allowed Christ to be put to death. You can read about that in Matthew 27, John 19, etc. It says, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil. So he's saying this superstition broke out at first from Judea. That was the first source of the evil, is what he said. But even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city. So he said they wasn't really convicted of firing the city or setting the city on fire. It says, as of hatred against mankind. So they were convicted of hating mankind, so-called. Because remember, again, this man is not a follower of the Messiah. Nero was not a follower of Christ. They were against Christ and his followers. And it says, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of beasts. So they covered up the Messianics with animal skins. It says they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses. It says, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. They were used as street lights during the nighttime, which is similar to what happened to our people here in the Americas. And it says, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of beasts. And then it says, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, which is exactly what we read in Psalms 22, verse 16, which says, for dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. We just read the historical documentation of a Roman historian who was not a subscriber to the belief that this Yeshua or Jesus was the Messiah. Yet he was a subscriber to the belief that this superstition broke out from Judea at the exact time that the Gospels tell us that it broke out. Secular history is confirming what the Gospels tell us. This is from Fox's Book of Martyrs, and it's referring to the same event. It says, this dreadful conflagration, which means fire, continued 9 days, when Nero, finding that his conduct was greatly blamed and a severe odium cast upon him, determined to lay the whole upon the Christians, at once to excuse himself and have an opportunity of glutting his sight with new cruelties. So when he saw that people were going to blame him or look at him in a negative light, he decided he was going to blame it on the Messianics. It says this was the occasion of the first persecution, and the barbarities exercised on the Christians were such as even excited the commiseration of the Romans themselves. Nero even refined upon cruelty and contrived all manner of punishment for the Christians that the most infernal imagination could design. So what the writer is expressing to us is that Nero was creative and innovative in his methods of torturing these so-called Christians. It says, in particular, he had some sewed up in skins of wild beasts and then worried by dogs until they expired, as we read a few minutes ago. It says, and others dressed in shirts made stiff with wax, fixed to axle trees, and set on fire in his gardens in order to illuminate them. This persecution was general throughout the whole Roman Empire, but it rather increased than diminished the spirit of Christianity. So he said this was generally going on throughout the whole Roman Empire, but rather than decrease or diminish, it actually increased the spirit of Christianity, which is the belief on Messiah. It says in the course of it, St. Paul and St. Peter were martyred. So this is the time where they were killed. It says, to their names may be added Erastus, Chamberlain of Corinth, Aristarchus the Macedonian, and Trophimus an Ephesian, converted by St. Paul and fellow laborer with him, Joseph, commonly called Barsabas, and Ananias, bishop of Damascus, each of the 70. We read about some of these individuals in the letters of Paul, and here in Luke 10 verse 1 we can read about the 70 that was just mentioned. It says, after these things the Lord appointed other 70 also. The Lord meaning Yahshua appointed other 70 also, and sent them two and two before his face into every city and place whither he himself would come. So he sent out 70 disciples to go and spread his message as well. That's who that's referring to. This is from the writings of the Greek writer Lucian, who was a satirist and who was known for making fun of and mocking religious rites and beliefs and superstition. And he's writing about a man named Peregrinus Proteus. Lucian was born about 125 AD, so he lived in the 2nd century. And he's writing, as I said, about Peregrinus Proteus, who was a Greek philosopher who lived in Israel for an amount of time in the 2nd century. And he says it was then that he, talking about Peregrinus, learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And how else could it be? He made them all look like children, for he was a prophet, cult leader, head of the synagogue, and everything all by himself. So according to his writing, this man was a cult leader. Remember again, though, that he was a satirist. So he was known for using satire as well as hyperbole in his writings. He then says, he interpreted and explained some of their books and even composed many. And they revered him as a god, made use of him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector. And then it says something interesting. Next after that other, to be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. So I want to be clear that he's saying that this man was some type of cult leader, and it says that they made use of him as a lawgiver and set him down as a protector. And then it says, next after that other, to be sure, whom they still worship. Who is he talking about? He says the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. Remember, this man is not a messianic. He's not a so-called Christian. But even he knows that someone was crucified in Palestine who introduced this new cult into the world. This is a reference to Christ, a secular reference. What we have here is more historical documentation from a 1st century Roman author by the name of Pliny the Younger, who was writing to Emperor Trajan. Now, Emperor Trajan was the emperor of Rome, starting at the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century, from about 98 AD to 117 AD. And he's writing to this emperor about how to deal with these Christians. And this is what he said. He said, "It is my practice, my Lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt." So he said, if I'm in doubt about something, I bring it to you. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. And I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature. Whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one, whether the name itself, even without offenses, or only the offenses associated with the name, are to be punished. So I need your advice and your counsel on how to judge these Christians. Because remember, so-called Christianity at this time was against their beliefs as Romans. And again, they were against Christians. They were not Christians. They were not messianics. They didn't believe on Christ. It says, "Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed." And this is consistent with what we read in the Gospels and Epistles about the persecution that's going to come on the saints. It says, those who persisted, he executed. Also, if they didn't actually believe that Christ was real and that he actually died for their sins, as recorded in the Gospels, they wouldn't have been willing to be put to death for that. So this also shows historically and secularly that there were a group of people in the first century who believed on this Israelite man and what he taught and what he said about himself, which is the narrative that we read in the Gospels. Then it says, "For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Soon accusations spread, as usually happens, because of the proceedings going on, and several incidents occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons, those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged." So he said, I let them go if they were willing to serve out and worship our gods, if they were willing to, pay homage to your image. I let them go if they did that, and if they cursed Christ, which is a reference obviously to Yahshua HaMashiach, to the person who started this belief system. And this is a first century, again, historian writing this, not somebody who was a believer on Christ either. It said, others named by the informer declared that they were Christians, but they denied it, asserting that they had been but had ceased to be, some 3 years before, others many years, some as much as 25 years. They all worshiped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. So he said there were some others who they were willing to curse Christ. They denied that they denied the faith. They had no problem with it. And then it says, they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error, so this is their explanation of what they did, what their crime was. He says, the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. So their error and their crime was that they wanted to follow the commandments. In a nutshell, is what that's saying. Now let's read from Josephus, the first century Israelite historian, from whom we get much of our information regarding first century Judea. He writes, about this time Aretas, the king of Arabia Petrea, and Herod had a quarrel on the account following. So he's about to let us know what their quarrel was. And this is Herod Antipas he's talking about. It says, Herod the Tetrarch had married the daughter of Aretas and had lived with her a great while. But when he was once at Rome, he lodged with Herod, and that's talking about Herod Philip, also known as Herod Philip II. It says he lodged with Herod, who was his brother indeed, but not by the same mother, for this Herod was the son of the high priest Simon's daughter. However, he fell in love with Herodias, this last Herod's wife. So Herod Antipas fell in love with Herod Philip II's wife, who was the daughter of Aristobulus, their brother, and the sister of Agrippa the Great. This man ventured to talk to her about a marriage between them. Herod Antipas and Herodias discussed being married. It says, which address when she admitted, an agreement was made for her to change her habitation and come to him as soon as he should return from Rome. They agreed that they would get married. It says one article of this marriage also was this, that he should divorce Aretas' daughter. Herod Antipas was already married, but he agreed to divorce his wife and marry his brother's wife. And it says he should divorce Aretas' daughter, and Aretas didn't like that. He was the king of Arabia Petrea. And it goes on to explain how they went to war partly because of that, because of how Herod Antipas was treating Aretas' daughter. We're not going to get into that because we have a point we're trying to get to. Now that you have some context, let's continue. It says, now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God. Why? Because Herod lost the battle to Aretas. And it says, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. So the Jews thought that it was punishment for him doing something to John the Baptist. They thought that that's why Herod's army lost. Let's see what he did. It said, for Herod slew him. So Herod killed him, just like we read in the Gospels. It said, who was a good man and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism, for that the washing with water would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Now when many others came in crowds about him, for they were very greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause. So he thought it was best to kill John the Baptist, to keep John the Baptist from causing him problems. And it says, and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it would be too late. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure to him. This is secular history that's confirming from a different perspective what the Gospels explain to us happened to John the Baptist. And really quickly, we read in the Gospels about how Herod, when he had heard of Christ and the miracles that he was doing, he thought that Christ was John the Baptist risen from the dead. In verse 16 of Mark 6, it says here, "But when Herod heard thereof, he said, It is John whom I beheaded. He is risen from the dead." And we just read Josephus, somebody that's not a Messianic Israelite, doesn't believe in Christ. He's just writing history, and he's confirming this. It says, "For Herod himself had sent forth and laid hold upon John, and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her." And Philip is Herod the second. He married his wife, just like we just read about their whole plan to get married. And it says, "For John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife." Let's read a little more from Josephus. He says, "And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus," and that's Porcius Festus, who was the procurator of Judea from about, I want to say 59 AD to about 62. It says, "Sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But the king," and if you don't know what a procurator is, they're not as high as the emperor, but they rule over a smaller land that's within the emperor's territory. It says, "But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus." So Ananus was the high priest, because Caesar, which is Nero, gave him that position. It says, "Now the report goes that his eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders. Above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed, when therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority." So now this high priest, Ananus, who's hot-tempered and a Sadducee, he wants to exercise his authority. And this is about 63 AD. It says, "Festus was now dead," as we already went over, "and Albinus was put upon the road." And Albinus is the procurator. It says, "So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So here we have another secular reference to Yahshua, and it says, "who was called Christ." And then it says the people that were assembled were his brother James, and we're going to see if he had a brother according to the epistles and the gospels named James. It says, "and some others." But then it goes on, it says, "But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done." And it says, "They also sent to the King Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for what he had already done was not to be justified." So he killed James, the brother of Christ. That's the long and short of it. And if we go to Galatians 1, we see that Paul said, "But other of the apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother." Mark 6 verse 3 says, talking about Christ, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James?" So that's more secular information that's corroborating what we read in the so-called New Testament. Another Roman historian from the 1st century AD by the name of Suetonius Tranquillus also wrote some historic information that is consistent with what we read in the so-called New Testament. Now he's writing about some events that took place under the reign of Claudius, who was the emperor of Rome, I want to say from 41 AD to 54 AD. And he's writing about what Claudius did to certain groups of people and various nations of people. And he says he banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Now, he said that all the Jews were banned from Rome by Claudius. And when he says at the instigation of one Chrestus, he could be referring to Christ here. Remember, Tacitus, as we read earlier, referred to Christ as Christus when he was saying that Christ was put to death by Pontius Pilate and was the leader or the originator of this sect called the Christians. The reason he called him Christus is because Christus is Latin for Christ. You understand that? And so here where it says Chrestus, you got to remember that Chrestus and Christus were used interchangeably at times in Latin, which is the language of this writer, Suetonius. He speaks Latin as well as Greek. So he could be speaking about Christ. And when it says that Claudius banned the Jews from Rome, let's go to Acts 18 and see if that's congruent with what we read here. And it says in verse 1, speaking about Paul, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Why? It says because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome and came unto them. So this is exactly what we just read that Suetonius said, that Claudius told the Jews to depart from Rome. So we have another secular witness to what we're reading in the so-called New Testament. And as you can see, if you continue to read this chapter, Aquila and Priscilla, when they came and saw Paul, it never said that Paul had to explain to them about Christ and who Christ was, which would make sense if they already knew about Christ, because they just came from Rome, where they were kicked out of Rome because many of the Israelites were, as Suetonius puts it, making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Now we know Christ had already been dead, but the faith and that was called the Way was becoming more and more popular at that time. It was disseminating among the different areas of Rome, and it was proliferating in different parts of the world at this time. I purposely quoted ancient historians and authors who were not followers of Christ so that it can't be said that they were making up these stories in order to propagate belief in Christ. Now, if you doubt the authenticity of the New Testament documents, which is to say, if you doubt that they were actually written in the first century by Israelites, like they claim to be, then you would also have to doubt the rest of what we know about ancient history, but hundreds of times more. You would have to say that virtually all historical documents are untrustworthy. Why is that? It's because there are over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the so-called New Testament. The reason they're in Greek is because it was one of the predominant languages in Rome during the first centuries AD and continued to be prominent into the Middle Ages and the Byzantine Empire. There are also over 10,000 Latin manuscripts and thousands more in Syriac, Coptic, Aramaic, and even Hebrew. But unfortunately, the Hebrew manuscripts that we know of aren't as old as many of these Greek and other manuscripts. And for those who don't know what a manuscript is, it's a handwritten document. So we have thousands more copies and manuscripts of what we call the New Testament than we have for any other work of antiquity. totaling over 24,000 manuscripts. The printing press wasn't invented until the 15th century, so in ancient times, scribes as well as laypersons would make handwritten copies of the New Testament for their various communities and congregations. These copies were themselves copied and so on, which is why we have so many copies today. This is also why the New Testament was never able to be controlled and changed by any one entity. It's because if someone changed their New Testament in an obvious way to say something different, it would be noticeable when they are compared to all the other copies that are in other places. You understand that? To make it simple, we can determine for the most part what the New Testament originally says by comparing the various manuscripts and giving the oldest and most common reading the precedence, generally speaking. If there was simply one original autographed copy that everyone depended on, then whoever possessed that copy could simply alter or destroy the text if they wanted to. So the Most High has preserved His word by giving us a plethora of manuscripts. And you may say to yourself, well, with so many copies, people make mistakes and there would be differences in the copies, and that's absolutely correct, that there are variations in the text, but 99% of the variations do not even alter the meaning of the text. For example, most are spelling differences or difference in phrasing. 99% of the differences don't matter for a thing. Bart Ehrman, who is one of the leading American scholars, who is an atheist, and whose objective is to discredit the reliability or the truth that's in the scriptures. Even he says, and I quote, "The New Testament is better attested than any other book in the ancient world." Logos.com, which is rated as the Bible's best software and most popular, says on their website, and I quote, "While copies of Homer's Iliad, arguably the most important text in Greco-Roman society, currently number 1,535 manuscripts, the New Testament manuscripts alone number the Greek New Testament manuscripts alone number close to 6,000. If you've done any serious study on Greek history, then you know about Herodotus, who is considered the father of Greek history, and they even call him the father of history sometimes. We get much of our information about the ancient world, especially about Greece, from him. According to Dutch historian Jonah Lindering, Herodotus' life's work, which is where we get the information from, called the Histories. Speaking about this, he says only 7 relevant manuscripts exist, called A, B, C, D, R, S, and V. That's less than 1% of how many good manuscripts we have of the New Testament. Plus, the time gap between when the New Testament was originally written and the earliest manuscripts that we know of is shorter than for most other ancient writings, which means the New Testament has the most early attestations. For example, Dan Wallace, who is a PhD professor in New Testament studies, says there are 3 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the average Greco-Roman author has in 2,000 years. Now we know that the New Testament was written in the 1st century, so that means we have more manuscripts of the New Testament that we know of that were written before the 3rd century AD than the average Greco-Roman author has that were written within 2,000 years of him writing his original documents. The late scholar Frederick Bruce, who was one of the most respected scholars on the subject of biblical accuracy, said the history of Thucydides is known to us from 8 manuscripts, the earliest belonging to AD 900, which is over 1,000 years after he lived, and a few papyrus scraps belonging to about the beginning of the Christian era. And then he says the same is true of the history of Herodotus, which we just went over. Yet no classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides is in doubt because the earliest manuscripts of their works, which are of any use to us, are over 1,300 years later than the originals. You understand that? 1,300 years later. That's what he's saying. And we have manuscripts of the New Testament that were written within, many scholars believe, 100 to 150 years from the originals. We're going to mention a few of them. There are at least 10 manuscripts that have been dated to the 2nd century AD. One of them, as you see on the screen, is called P98, and it's a Greek manuscript that's dated to the 2nd century that contains Revelation 1, verse 13 through 2 and verse 1. And it's now at the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology. Another one which you see on the screen also is P46. It's also a Greek manuscript and is dated to around 175 to 200 AD. It records Paul's writings, including Ephesians, Romans, Hebrews, Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, and Thessalonians. And there's 86 leaves remaining of this document. Another one is called P52, and it's the oldest known fragment of St. John's Gospel and the oldest known fragment that we have of the New Testament in general. It's less than 9 centimeters high, and it contains verses 31 through 33 of John chapter 18, as well as verses 37 and 38. And it's currently in the John Reynolds Library in Manchester. It was discovered in Egypt and is dated to about 125 AD. Now, John died around 100 AD. And he was thought to have written his Gospels around 90 AD. So you do the math. Keep in mind that the New Testament was originally written most likely in Hebrew and also Aramaic. In fact, Irenaeus, who was known as one of the church fathers, who lived in the 2nd century and who met and learned from Polycarp. And Polycarp was a disciple of John, the John who wrote Revelation, John the Apostle. This Irenaeus, he even said himself that Matthew wrote a gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. That's what he wrote. If you're interested in this and other information regarding the Bible, history, and current events, I welcome you to join us on Patreon, where we'll be covering these and other topics in more detail. Shalom.